May I have a motion for item G1, community programs?
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Becker, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. May I have a motion for item H1 and 2,
So moved.
curriculum instruction? Motion by
Second.
Mrs. Becker, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. May I have a motion for item I1, facilities?
So moved.
Motion by
Second.
Mrs. Becker, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. May I have a motion for items J1 through J11?
So moved.
Second.
Motion by Mr. Cankro, second by Mrs. Becker. Is there any discussion? Financial services.
On J6.
Mrs. Chu.
the Enterprise profit and loss. I just have a question about, it just looks like the police report was showing, this is child nutrition, July through December, the loss compared to last year's July through December was 80,000 loss this period versus 20,000 loss last period. So I was just wondering what was driving that difference.
Mr. Crutchfield?
We paid out the bonuses that the board approved for the child nutrition workers in December. We've had increased health benefit costs for a couple of the employees. They changed from single to family. We're also charging an indirect cost rate that you see on the P&L. I believe through December was about $12,000 and change, which that's the first time that we're charging child nutrition at indirect cost rate. That pretty much gives a little bit of money back to the general fund for utilities that we were not able to charge in the past because of the financial status. So that accounts for the $70,000. I will say through January, and you'll get that next board meeting, the profit for the month of January was $45,000. So we're about $50,000 off compared to last year, but it's all accounted for and we expected it. So, it's still trending where we want it to be, and by the end of the year.
So by year end,
Yeah.
we'll be able to reverse that and
Yeah.
be positive.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Crutchfield.
Anyone else on financial items? Will the secretary please call the roll?
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mr. Cankro?
Yes.
Mrs. Chu?
Yes.
Mr. Hong?
Yes.
Mrs. Lax?
Yes.
Mrs. Reese?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
President Simmons?
Yes, motion carries. May I have a motion for item K1, human resources?
So moved.
Motion by Mrs.
Second.
Becker, second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? Will the secretary please call the roll?
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mr. Cankro?
Yes.
Mrs. Chu?
Yes.
Mr. Hong?
Yes.
Mrs. Lax?
Yes.
Mrs. Reese?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
President Simmons?
Yes, motion carries. May I have a motion for item L1, staff
moved.
development? Motion by Mrs. Becker.
Second.
Second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. May I have a motion for items M1 through 5, student services?
So moved.
Motion by Mrs. Becker,
Second.
second by Mrs. Shaw. Is there any discussion? Will the secretary please call the roll?
Mrs. Becker?
Yes.
Mr. Cankro?
Yes.
Mrs. Chu?
Yes.
Mr. Hong?
Yes.
Mrs. Lax?
Yes.
Mrs. Reese?
Yes.
Mrs. Shaw?
Yes.
President Simmons?
Yes, motion carries. Next, we have committee reports, information.